Ever feel like you don't really own your own home? You pay to live there, but every day you have to follow ridiculous rules: lawn height, door color, parking spot, even mailbox style. And if you don't follow them, fines, warnings, threats, even loss of property. Want to know what happened when I confronted my HOA? Overthrew the system they built and made the leader pay in ways she never expected? Follow this story. Who knows, you might be next. But don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on crazy HOA stories. The deafening sound of metal on concrete jolted me from my deep sleep. The feeling that something was wrong filled my chest before I even realized what was happening. I jumped up, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. The morning sun was shining through the curtains, but what caught my attention was the scene unfolding before me. A giant yellow bulldozer was crushing the concrete floor of my garage like it had never existed. Shock ran down my spine, and then rage. I didn't think, I just acted. I just put on my running shoes and ran outside, the burning sensation of the road seeping through the soles of my shoes not bothering me. The roar of the engine drowned out my screams of anger, but I screamed anyway, my body tensing with rage as I watched the bulldozer crush what was left of the roller shutter where I had kept the vintage car my father had left me before he died. The workers in orange overalls continued their work as if I didn't exist. They didn't flinch, they didn't hesitate, they just followed orders, and I didn't have to guess who was behind it. When I turned around, Victoria Hale was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, a satisfied smirk on her perfectly made-up face. My anger flared even more as I looked into her cold, unrepentant eyes. Victoria didn't care that she had just destroyed a piece of my property, a place that held my last memories of my father. To her, it was just another move in the power game she had been playing for so long as HOA president. I was no stranger to HOAs. I ignored their ridiculous rules, didn't attend the meetings Victoria ran as if she were a queen of her own empire. I didn't trim my lawn to the height they required or bother to repaint my fence because the color didn't fit in with the neighborhood aesthetic. But never before had the HOA taken action this drastic. They sent a warning? No. They sent an official notice? No. Just a scrawled note under my door last night, and less than 12 hours later they brought in a bulldozer to demolish my garage. I clenched my fists, my breath coming in short gasps as shards of concrete flew under the bulldozer's blades. Inside the garage, my father's tools, the old wrenches he used to fix cars, were crushed under the rubble. The old car he'd left me, his last gift, was now a twisted pile of metal. Victoria knew I would react, and I was sure she was savoring every moment of it. I walked into the house, slamming the door behind me, but the anger in my chest wouldn't go away. This wasn't just about some stupid regulation. This was about power. She wanted to teach me that in this neighborhood, the HOA had the final say, and anyone who dared to defy it would pay the price. She thought I would cave. She thought I would accept defeat like the other residents who had tried to fight back but were crushed under unreasonable fines, lengthy lawsuits, and financial pressure to the point where they were forced to sell their homes and leave. But Victoria made a terrible mistake. She doesn't know who I am. I'm Ethan Walker, and I'm Sheriff Samuel Walker's son. She destroyed my garage? Fine. But I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to fight back, and when I do, Victoria Hale will regret ever thinking she could beat me. I need to find a way to beat her, not with my fists, but with something she can't ignore, the truth. And if there's one thing I know about people like Victoria, it's that where there's power, there's corrupt. I sat down at my desk and opened my old laptop that I hadn't used in months. I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to dig for information when I need it. If an HOA has a weakness, it's its finances. The fees they charge residents, the ridiculous fines. Where does all that money go? Are they actually using it to improve the community, or is it just going into someone else's pocket? I started looking. The official HOA website looked neat and professional, but when I tried to find their financial statements, I realized there were no public documents. Any organization that collects money from residents should have transparent reporting, but Victoria's HOA had none of that. I tried another approach, logging into the resident system where people can view fees and regulations. It took a while to dig through, but I found a list of expenses, and I knew immediately that I had found what I was looking for. The numbers didn't add up. Annual HOA fines were in the tens of thousands of dollars. But there was no meaningful spending on neighborhood improvements. There were no street maintenance reports, no park repair bills, not even streetlight maintenance. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. When I compared the spending to what was actually happening in the neighborhood, I found huge sums of money listed under vague categories like infrastructure improvements or administrative operating expenses. There were no receipts attached, no details about how the money was actually spent. But what really got me to the heart of the corruption was the excessive spending on things that had nothing to do with the HOA. I found expensive payments for luxury hotels, fees sent to high-end spas, upscale restaurants, even a designer handbag store. There was no legitimate reason for a neighborhood association to spend money on such things. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Victoria wasn't just tyrannical, she was corrupt. I dug deeper. If Victoria had blatantly embezzled HOA funds, she certainly hadn't done it alone. I looked back at the HOA board list and found some familiar names. Some board members had lived here for years without anyone knowing what they were doing. Others had joined the board undercover after members who opposed Victoria abruptly left the community. The more I learned, the more I realized that this was not just personal corruption, but a system that was silently draining the residents' money. This was no longer just between me and Victoria, but a war for the entire neighborhood. She had ruled this place like a queen, controlling, intimidating, and profiting from the misery of others. But now I had proof, and I was going to destroy the empire she had built. However, to bring Victoria down, I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies. And I knew exactly where to start. Mike Henderson. When I arrived at his house, the memory of the last time we spoke about the non-compliant mailbox the HOA had forced him to replace over and over was still fresh in my mind. When I knocked on the door, Mike opened it almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for this. His years of suffering under the HOA were etched on his face, but when I told him what I had discovered, his eyes lit up with a determination I had never seen before. Mike was not just a victim of the HOA, he was a living witness to what Victoria had done to this neighborhood. He had lived here for over 30 years and had watched the HOA transform from a useful institution into a tool of oppression at the hands of Victoria. And most importantly, he had proof. I flipped through the papers Mike had laid out on his desk. A record of abuses, unjustified fines, ignored complaints, threatening emails from residents, people forced to sell their homes under financial duress from the HOA, an entire system built to profit from fear. But I needed more. I needed to get the truth out. And there was only one person who could help me do it: Sarah Mitchell. Sarah and I had been best friends since college, but our lives had taken us in different directions. While I had served in the Army and then returned home, she had pursued journalism and become one of the toughest investigative reporters I knew. I called her that night, and after just a few sentences I could hear the excitement in her voice. "How much evidence do you have?" "Everything it takes to bring Victoria down from her throne." We met the next morning at a small coffee shop far from the community. I didn't want Victoria or anyone in the HOA to know that I was planning to overthrow her. When I laid all the documents down on the table, it took Sarah less than 2 minutes to realize the seriousness of the situation. Victoria wasn't just profiting from the HOA. She had been embezzling tens of thousands of dollars over the years, and no one noticed because she controlled everything. No one dared to challenge her because they were afraid of being fined, evicted, or buried in a lengthy lawsuit. But now we had a chance to change that. Sarah began taking pictures, taking notes, and contacting several real estate sources to verify the suspicious payments I had found. Meanwhile, Mike and I went out to find more residents who had been unjustly punished by the HOA. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that the anger wasn't limited to a few people. Victoria had made enemies of the entire neighborhood. We found dozens of people willing to speak out, from families who had been forced to repaint their houses multiple times because she didn't like the color, to seniors who had been fined for placing potted plants on their porches incorrectly. This wasn't just about me, it was about everyone. Victoria had grown accustomed to controlling the neighborhood with fear. What she didn't realize was that once that fear turned to anger, it became something she couldn't control. And now that anger was boiling over. The HOA meeting was held on Thursday evening at the community center. It was a small building, built with the residents' own money, but ironically it was where Victoria Hale exerted her power and sway over everyone. I had always avoided meetings like this, not wanting to waste time with Victoria's ridiculous rules, but tonight things would be different. When I entered the room, the air was strangely heavy. Residents had gathered, many for the first time in years at an HOA meeting. They had come not because they cared about lawn mowing regulations or fence colors, but because they were tired of Victoria's autocratic rule. And tonight they would know the truth. Victoria stood at the front of the room, still looking like a queen about to issue a command. She was dressed in an expensive suit. Her hair was neatly combed. Her face was immaculately made up. Looking at her, no one would imagine that in a few hours she would be judged by the very residents she ruled. She opened the meeting in her usual tone, talking about community spirit and the steps the HOA was taking to protect property values. But I wasn't here to hear those lies. I stood up. The sound of a chair creaking echoed in the silence as I stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents on the table. Victoria raised her eyebrows but said nothing. She had no idea what was coming. I looked straight at the crowd, my voice not needing to be shouted but firm enough to make everyone listen. I started with the numbers. I listed every HOA dues revenue, every unreasonable fine residents were forced to pay, every payment the HOA had made over the past 5 years. Then I pointed to the expenses. There was nothing for park maintenance, nothing for road repairs. But there were tens of thousands of dollars listed under administrative expenses. I opened the folder, turned to the most important page. Spa receipts. First-class airfare, lavish dinners at the most expensive restaurants in town, a $5,000 check to a designer handbag store. Victoria stiffened. I saw her hands tighten at her sides, but she remained calm. I didn't stop there. I pulled my phone from my pocket and pulled up a recording. Victoria's voice echoed in the quiet room, cold and contemptuous. We just need to keep finding them, and those who can't pay leave. The more homes that are foreclosed on, the more chances there are to sell them for a higher price. The room fell into a deadly silence. Then, as if a tsunami had broken its banks, whispers, chatter, and shouts broke out. An elderly man stood up, his face red with anger. A woman in the front row hugged her husband, tears welling up in her eyes. Another resident, who had had her house repainted 3 times because Victoria didn't like the color, screamed in outrage. Victoria tried to regain control. She reached out as if to calm the crowd, but this time no one listened. "These documents are all fake. Her voice was strained. "Do you really believe him? This is a hoax, a plot to smear me." I smirked, crossing my arms over my chest. "Really? You think I made up all these numbers myself? The receipts, the bank statements, this recording?" She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. She knew there was no going back. A member of the HOA board, a middle-aged man named Richard, stood up with a serious expression on his face. "We need a formal investigation," he said, and for the first time, no one objected. Victoria looked around, seeing the support she once had crumble. Faces that had once bowed to her in fear now looked at her with hatred and contempt. She had lost control, and I knew this was only the beginning of Victoria Hale's downfall. I knew Victoria wouldn't give up easily. People like her never accepted defeat without retaliation. She had built an empire on control and fear, and I had just shattered it before everyone's eyes. But I didn't expect her to act so quickly. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of unease. It was barely light, but a strange sound outside made me sit up. The sound of chains hitting metal. I rushed outside, my heart pounding in my chest, and my anger flared up again. Ahead of me, a tow truck was backing into my driveway. The driver, dressed in HOA uniform, got out with a stony expression, a file in his hand. A thick chain was hooked to the undercarriage of my truck, ready to be pulled away at any moment. I strode toward the man, not bothering to ask what was going on because I already knew. This was Victoria. This was her move, a desperate attempt to silence me, to make me understand that I was still just a regular resident and she still controlled the HOA. The driver didn't seem to want to cause trouble, but when I snatched the paperwork from him and glanced through it, I almost laughed at how ridiculous it was. HOA violations. First truck not registered to HOA standards. Totally ridiculous. I registered the vehicle long ago and never received any notices before. Second, parking in the wrong location. I always park in my lot. No one has any right to interfere. Last, failure to maintain exterior of vehicle as required by HOA. Another ridiculous clause that Victoria must have made up to make this legal. Everything was made up. She couldn't find a way to take me down with the law, so she decided to bend the law to her liking. But if Victoria thought I would stand by and let her do something dirty, she had underestimated me. I took out my phone and called the police, not because I needed them to intervene, I knew I could handle it myself, but because I wanted to create an official record of Victoria's behavior. When Sarah's investigation into the HOA was complete, I wanted to make sure that every instance was documented, every time the HOA used its rules to harass residents, every time Victoria abused her power for personal gain. The driver looked at me uncertainly as I walked away, but he knew I wouldn't budge. When the police arrived, he was forced to unchain the car and drive away. But that didn't mean Victoria would stop. When I returned home that afternoon, there was a bright red piece of paper taped to my front door, another violation notice. The reason? Failure to comply with landscaping regulations. I looked down at my lawn, feeling a surge of anger. This was blatant retaliation. My grass wasn't too tall, there was no violation, but Victoria didn't care about that fact. She just wanted to make things difficult for me, to make me feel like my life would become unbearable if I continued to resist. But I knew the game. She thought she could wear out my patience with these dirty tricks. What Victoria didn't realize was that every move she made only emboldened me. She could try to have my car towed. She could fine me thousands of dollars. She could post as many traffic notices on my door as she wanted, but she forgot one thing. I wasn't the type to be intimidated by these pieces of paper, and that scared her more than anything else. She'd gone too far. I pulled out my phone, but this time I didn't call the local police. I didn't want a patrol officer coming to deal with another HOA violation just so Victoria could find a way to bend the rules and continue her game. I needed a hit, and I knew only one person who could help me do it. I dialed the number and put the phone to my ear. A deep voice came on the second ring. "Dad, I need you to help me with something." Sheriff Samuel Walker wasn't one to intervene in civil strife, but he knew me. He knew I wouldn't call over some ridiculous ticket or a car that was about to be towed. I wasn't the type to call for help unless I had a good reason. And as I began to tell him what I had found, the missing money, the falsified invoices, the unreasonable payments in the HOA's books, I could feel the change in his voice. My dad was a man of principle. He believed in the law, that justice should not be manipulated by those with power and money. And now he knew that Victoria had done just that. 24 hours later, the police officially opened an investigation into the HOA. The next morning, I woke to the familiar sound of a car engine, but this time it wasn't a bulldozer or an HOA trailer. It was a police car. 2 black SUVs parked in front of the HOA office, their lights flashing in the early morning light. I stood on my front steps, arms crossed, watching as 3 uniformed officers walked through the glass doors of the building. It took only 30 minutes for everything to start to fall into chaos. Victoria walked out of the office, her usually cool and arrogant face now filled with tension. I could see her talking to one of the police officers, her hands flailing as if she were trying to justify herself. But this time, there was no one standing behind her to defend her. No HOA board to nod in agreement with whatever excuse she might make. I didn't need to hear it to know what was going on. The investigation didn't just focus on the ridiculous amounts in the HOA's books, but also expanded to a series of shady financial transactions I had uncovered. When Sarah Mitchell submitted her full dossier to the authorities, she included evidence of how Victoria and her close associates had laundered HOA money for personal use, embezzling tens of thousands of dollars and using it to fund her lavish lifestyle. I watched as the police carried computers, boxes of documents, and hard drives from the HOA office to the car. The evidence that Sarah, Mike Henderson, and I had spent weeks gathering was now turning into what would end Victoria. Other residents had gathered around, talking, pointing. Some were whispering, others were visibly outraged. I could see them, people who had been fined thousands of dollars for some obscure infraction, people who had been forced to make repairs to their homes according to Victoria's code, people who had thought they had no voice. But today, everything had changed. Today, Victoria was no longer in control. One of the officers walked up to her saying something I couldn't make out, but I saw Victoria flinch, her eyes wide, her mouth hanging open as if she couldn't believe this was really happening. I didn't need to hear what they were saying. I knew. Victoria Hale was officially under investigation for financial fraud. She wasn't going to get away with this, not this time. I stood on the porch, watching the scene unfold as if I were witnessing a play whose ending I already knew. The police cars were still parked in front of the HOA office, their lights flashing in the windows. Tension hung over the neighborhood, but this time it wasn't fear of Victoria Hale, but of her demise. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The documents that Mike, Sarah, and I provided were not only enough to put an end to Victoria, but also to open a major rift in the system she had built. In less than 48 hours, auditors were sent to review all of the HOA's financial records. And it didn't take long for them to realize that this was more than just a financial fraud. It was a web of corruption that had been going on for years. There were falsified invoices, embezzled HOA funds, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in unwarranted expenses. But the most remarkable thing was that Victoria wasn't the only one involved. Several members of the HOA board were also drawn into the investigation. Those who had turned a blind eye to Victoria's abuses now feared for their own lives. I saw them, once proud faces at HOA meetings, standing still, staring at the ground, trying to distance themselves from the woman they had once loyally pursued. And then, the moment they had all been waiting for arrived. The door to the HOA office swung open, and 2 police officers stepped out, followed by a handcuffed Victoria Hale. No longer in her powerful suit, no longer proud, she looked more disheveled than ever. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, her eyes bewildered. She tried to keep her back straight as she walked down the steps, but everyone could see the panic that had gripped her. Residents had gathered around, and when Victoria stepped out the door, silence fell over the neighborhood. A heavy silence, as if everyone was trying to confirm that this was really happening. Then, little by little, whispers began to rise. A man standing nearby shook his head, clutching the citation the HOA had sent him. Another woman, who had been forced by Victoria to repaint her house 3 times, pursed her lips in suppressed anger. Then, a voice from behind said, "She deserves it." Others nodded, the chatter growing louder. But no one shouted, no one laughed. There was no gloating or cheering, there was only relief. A weight lifted from their shoulders after years of oppression. Victoria turned, her eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for one last sign of support, a glimmer of hope that someone was still on her side. But there was no one. She had lost everything. The police car doors slammed shut and the car started to roll away. I watched it not with joy, but with the end of an old chapter, an era of tyranny that Victoria had imposed on the neighborhood. But I knew it wasn't over. With Victoria in custody, the entire HOA system she had built would collapse. The board was dissolved and new elections were held to ensure that power would never be abused again. The residents could finally take back what was rightfully theirs, a community no longer controlled by intimidation, a place they could truly call home. I walked home, feeling for the first time in months that I could breathe a sigh of relief. But there was one last thought in my mind. Victoria might have been caught. But people like her never accepted defeat easily, and I knew this battle was not really over. It ended on a clear morning, with no bulldozers, no ridiculous tickets taped to my door, no powerful eyes watching my every move. Willow Creek was finally back in the hands of its rightful owners. No more overbearing HOAs, no more unreasonable regulations, no more Victoria Hale standing atop her own pedestal. I stood on my porch, a hot cup of coffee in my hand, looking out over the peaceful neighborhood I had fought to preserve. Everything had changed. Neighbors who had bowed to the HOA were laughing and joking with each other, no longer afraid of unexpected fines or unreasonable regulations imposed on them. The HOA signs that had once been scattered throughout the neighborhood, reminding residents of the unreasonable rules, had been removed. Instead, a new council is being created, one that truly represents the interests of the community, not just the enrichment of a powerful person. I thought I would feel gloating, but it never came. I didn't feel gloating over Victoria's capture or happy to see her fall. I felt only relief, the feeling of someone who had fought for so long and finally been released. But Victoria Hale's fate wasn't quite over. Sarah was the one who sent me the first photo. A simple text, no explanation. When I opened it, it took me a few seconds to realize what I was seeing. Victoria Hale, the tyrannical former HOA president who had used her power to control every blade of grass, every brick in this neighborhood, was standing behind the counter of the local supermarket. She wore a uniform blue polo shirt, her hair tied back, her face devoid of the arrogance of her past. Her name tag read simply, Victoria Hale, customer service representative. I couldn't help but laugh. Justice comes in many forms. For Victoria, it wasn't immediate jail time or a huge fine. Her biggest punishment was being forced to live the life she despised. No more meetings where she sat high above the residents barking orders. No more absolute power to punish anyone who didn't follow her orders. No more HOA money to squander. Just a regular job. A life she no longer controlled. I didn't go to see her right away, I didn't need to. But when I happened to be passing by the supermarket late one afternoon, I decided to go in, just to witness the moment I saw in the photo. Victoria didn't notice me right away as I stood in line, but when I put my things on the counter and she looked up, I saw a flash of recognition cross her eyes. I didn't say anything, I just smiled. She tightened her grip on the plastic bag as she placed my things in it, trying to maintain the cool facade she had during her HOA president days, but this time it didn't work. There was no power for her to cling to, no rules for her to abuse, no one for her to threaten, just me, standing there with a look in my eyes that said one thing: you lost. I took the bag, nodded politely, and turned to leave. I didn't need to say anything. All that needed to be said was the situation she was in. When I returned home that evening, I sat on the porch again, just as I had done that morning. The lake in front of me reflected the gentle sunset, the wind blew through the trees, the air was strangely peaceful. For the first time in months, there was nothing to worry about. No power plays, no threats, no fear lurking at every step. I had regained the peace I deserved, and this time I would not let anyone take it away from me again.